Hi, Duha. Thanks for tuning in. We are going to continue on lecture 3. So this is kind of the second portion of that lecture. We've been talking about acute aerobic exercise and some of the cardiovascular changes associated with acute aerobic exercise. So we've spent some time in class talking about heart rate and stroke volume. We talked about the 4 factors associated with stroke volume changes when we participate in acute exercise. And we started our conversation, or we ended class talking about cardiac output. And we know that because heart rate and stroke volume are both increasing, cardiac output will also increase. Let me get my little pointer here. Will also increase linearly with exercise intensity. So the harder we work, the more oxygen we need to deliver, and so therefore we'll see this linear increase in cardiac output as well. So at rest, we see our cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute. And during maximal exercise, it can be somewhere between 20 to 40 liters per minute. Maximal cardiac output, again, notice the substantial difference that we can see. And 2 factors that are going to be important to determining how high your maximal cardiac output is going to be body size and endurance training. Okay, so again, the larger someone is, the more oxygen they're going to need because they're going to need to support more organs and more skeletal muscle, things like that. And then endurance training will certainly increase our ability to deliver more blood per minute. Okay, so our maximal heart rate isn't really going to be modified with endurance training, but we can modify our stroke volume, and we can certainly modify the amount of blood that we have. And so those 2 factors will allow us to increase the maximal cardiac output that we will see with endurance training. So again, 2 factors we're looking at here are body size and endurance training. Okay. Additionally, let me get my notes here organized. When we think about this increase in cardiac output, it's important for us to note where is that blood actually going. And here you can see that as we increase our cardiac output associated with acute exercise, we're going to see this increase in a linear fashion. We're going to increase blood flow specifically to the muscles. And again, the cool thing about this is this can be very specific to the muscles that you're utilizing. So in class, I gave the example, if I am biking, again, I don't really care about sending blood to my arms, for example, but I do care about sending more blood to like my leg muscles. So we'll see an increase in blood flow to the muscles that are activated during that particular exercise bout. Notice that renal blood flow will stay about the same. We also see cerebral blood flow, or blood flow to the brain, and the liver will stay about the same. We see just a very, very small increase in coronary blood flow, or the blood flow to the heart tissue itself. Skin blood flow can be modified depending on the environmental conditions. So if it is hot, we will send more blood to the skin so that it can help with like heat dissipation. But take away a message from this slide is that as we see this linear increase in cardiac output, it's important to note that almost all of that blood is going to exclusively go to the muscles that we are utilizing during that exercise bout. So in regards to understanding cardiac output, it's important to note that the cardiovascular system is a closed loop system. And what we mean by that is that we're not really seeing a change in input or output, okay? So the blood is going to move in this closed loop system. So we're just recycling the blood, back through the heart, right? So we're not changing the volume very much in this system, okay? So the volume essentially stays the same. Okay, so 2 factors determine the outflow of fluid from the pump in a closed loop system, okay? So we can look at, again, the heart rate and stroke volume, and that tells us the output of blood from this pump or from the heart, okay? Again, we can change concentration of the substance between the outflow and inflow ports of the pump. So again, we'll see a small change in like the composition or the amount of blood that we have, but the total quantity of a substance being taken up or given off by the fluid in a given amount of time gives us information about what's changing within this closed loop system. Okay, so again, the Fick method helps us determine cardiac output or the amount of blood that we're sending out in each minute. So it's important for us to know the VO2. So again, how much oxygen am I utilizing in a given minute? And also the AVO2 difference. What's the difference in the amount of oxygen that I deliver and the amount of oxygen then that is leaving the tissue? Okay, so AVO2 difference, again, we're looking at artery, vein, oxygen difference, arteriovenous oxygen difference. So we're looking at how much oxygen do we have in the veins or in that deoxygenated blood in comparison to how much oxygen did we bring to that particular tissue. So AVO2 difference tells us information about the delivery, how much oxygen is extracted at that tissue level. Okay, so it's important for us to know how much oxygen we're delivering and then also how much we're utilizing, or this VO2 max. Okay, and this is what the Fick method is. Cardiac output is equivalent to VO2 divided by AVO2 difference, or the oxygen extraction ratio. So one thing that we noted in our lecture in class was this modification in blood flow distribution that we can see when we participate in acute exercise. Okay, so basically what we're trying to say is we can modify where we're sending blood, and we can do this by the vasoconstriction, or the shrinking of vessels, or vasodilation, the increasing of the vessel sizes. Okay, so blood flow changes are related to changes in vessel sizes. Okay, so factors within the active muscle are going to allow us to see more vasodilation at that active tissue. So again, we said that that was pretty freaking cool that we're able to vasodilate just in the areas where we need it, and this is how we do so. So factors that are going to occur within the active muscle, we're going to see a release of nitric oxide at the level of the active tissue. Okay, so when I start contracting a muscle, for example, if I'm biking and I have the contraction of my leg muscles, for example, I'm going to release nitric oxide, and that's going to cause vasodilation at that local level. Okay, so at the local level, so at the level of those leg muscles, for example, nitric oxide will facilitate vasodilation. Okay, kidneys and splenic regions will actually decrease their blood flow. So again, we'll see vasoconstriction in those particular areas. So we're going to send less blood to those particular areas. Again, the nitric oxide is a local factor. So again, that's going to happen just in those specific muscles where we're utilizing more blood or more oxygen. We also have a more kind of all-encompassing effect. So the activation of the sympathetic nervous system will cause the release of catecholamines, so your epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those will bind to alpha receptors, and those alpha receptors will cause vasodilation in the skeletal muscle, but the alpha receptors will cause vasoconstriction in areas that are less important, such as your digestive organs. Okay. Again, this just shows you the relationship between blood flow as it compares resting and heavy exercise. So again, we said cardiac output at rest is around 5 liters per minute. And notice that about 20 to 25% of that blood is going to the digestive organs, 20% is going to the kidneys so that we can filter it, 15% going to the brain so we can think good, and maybe 20-ish% going to the muscles, right? So notice that during heavy exercise, we have increased our cardiac output 5-fold, and notice that now a small percentage is going to the digestive organs, a small percentage is going to the kidneys to be filtered, and the majority of our blood is going to go to those skeletal muscles that we talked about. So again, that gives us some information about what's going on in relation to blood flow. Now let's take a look at what happens with blood pressure. Okay, so again, we know that blood pressure is the pressure exerted on the artery walls, and there's two types. So we have systolic blood pressure, and that's the pressure exerted during the heart's contraction, and diastolic blood pressure is the pressure exerted when the heart is relaxing. Okay, so I've provided 4 different scenarios so that we can understand what's going on from a blood pressure standpoint in various scenarios related to exercise. So during steady state aerobic exercise, so imagine this as like your, a moderate intensity on the elliptical. So again, you're not going too hard. It's a nice, comfortable pace. What we're going to see is we're going to have vasodilation in the muscles that we're using, and this causes a decrease in PPR, or total peripheral resistance. Okay, so basically, as I increase the size of those vessels, the blood flowing through the vessels has less resistance to overcome. So this is going to reduce the resistance that blood needs to overcome in order to flow through that particular tube. It also is going to enhance blood flow to the periphery. So again, as I open up those tubes, it makes it easier for the blood to flow to the muscles in the periphery, right? So what happens with blood pressure when I do steady state aerobic exercise? I'm going to increase my systolic pressure within the first few minutes, and that should level off to about 140 to 160 millimeters of mercury once we reach kind of a steady state. So again, if my resting systolic blood pressure is about 120, when I do moderate steady state exercise, I will increase my systolic pressure to somewhere between 140 to 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay. Diastolic pressure will remain the same as what it was at rest, and the reason for that is we have this decrease in resistance, so it's easier for the blood to flow, so therefore we don't see much of a change in diastolic pressure. Okay. Graded exercise. So again, what we mean by graded exercise is exercise that's stepwise. So it gets harder in kind of a stepwise fashion. So we do a graded exercise test for our VO2 max test. So we'll have people get on the treadmill, and every 3 minutes the speed gets faster or the incline gets higher. So that's what graded exercise is. It's exercise that gradually gets harder. Okay, so systolic blood pressure will increase linearly with exercise intensity. However, during maximal exercise, it will kind of level off around 200 millimeters of mercury. So the systolic maximal pressure around 200 millimeters of mercury is the same kind of regardless of your training status. So again, an untrained person and a trained person will still experience the same change in systolic blood pressure. It's just a matter of when we're going to reach that particular maximum. Okay, so again, for an untrained person, maybe they can run on the treadmill and their maximum speed is like 7 miles per hour or something along those lines, right? Whereas with a trained individual, maybe their max speed is closer to 10 miles per hour or something along those lines, okay? So the systolic blood pressure from an absolute standpoint would be equivalent. However, the absolute intensity at which I reach that can vary depending on training status. Diastolic pressure will remain the same. It could potentially even decrease, and the reason for that is this vast vasodilation that we're going to experience in the vessels that are leading to the skeletal muscle. Okay. Blood pressure during upper body exercise. So again, think about something like one of those hand ergometers or hand cycle. This will produce considerably higher systolic and diastolic changes in comparison to leg exercises. And the reason for that is you have smaller muscles in your upper extremity. So vasculature offers greater resistance to blood flow in comparison to your legs, because your legs have a larger muscle mass. Okay. In exercise recovery, we can see a hypotensive response. So with exercise recovery, we're looking at what's happening immediately post-exercise. Hypo means lower, so tensive means pressure, so we have a low pressure response, okay? So this hypotensive response means that our blood pressure can actually dip down lower than what it was to start with. And I want you to think about what's going on in regards to determining pressure in order for us to figure out why this is happening. Okay, so again, I want you to think about like the Mississippi River, for example. Okay, there's two factors that we need to think about in order to determine the pressure exerted by the water on the walls of the river. Think of it that way. Okay, so number one is the amount of water or the speed at which the water is flowing. Okay, and so in the body, that's equivalent to the cardiac output, right? So how fast is my heart pumping and how much blood am I pumping out per contraction? Okay, so the higher my cardiac output, the greater the pressure, right? The other factor that's important to consider is the size of the river, right? If the river is really wide, then that makes it easier for the pressure to be lower, right? If the river is super skinny, then that increases the pressure because there's less places for the blood to push up against, if that makes sense. Okay, so two factors we need to consider are the flow of the water, or the flow of the blood, and the size of the vessel. Okay, so what happens immediately when we stop exercise is that our heart rate is going to decrease pretty quickly, especially if we're fit. We can get our heart rate down fairly quickly. Okay, so within a couple minutes or within 20 minutes, we could say, we probably are back to our resting heart rate. Okay, so the flow of blood is slowing down pretty quickly. However, the size of the tube, remember that we had this vasodilation occurring in all the active muscles, that's going to stay vasodilated for kind of a long time, right? So again, the tube stays wide, but we decrease the flow through the tube. So therefore we see this dramatic drop in blood pressure. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why doing a cool down is important for us, because it will allow us to gradually bring our heart rate down as opposed to going from 200 beats per minute back to your resting level like very quickly. That's too dramatic of a change, and so therefore that can cause us some issues with blood pressure. Hypotensive response is absolutely great. This is one of the reasons why for people that are hypertensive or who have high blood pressure, moderate aerobic exercise is a great treatment for them, because this hypotensive response can occur or last up to 12 hours post-exercise. Okay, so this hypotensive response can occur with basically all exercise, and again, this can be caused by venous pooling during recovery and that immediate decrease in heart rate. This is why aerobic exercise is an excellent treatment for hypertension. Okay. So we also said that there will be some changes within the blood itself when we do acute aerobic exercise. And the first change that we want to consider is our change in plasma volume. Okay. So at the onset of exercise, again, remember that as we increase heart rate, we're going to increase blood pressure. And due to this increase in pressure, we are going to have an immediate decrease in plasma volume. So as we increase the pressure, some of that fluid will shift from inside the tube to outside of the tube to interstitial space. This can cause a reduction of 10 to 15% of fluid. So 10 to 15% of the fluid that's in our blood can move into that interstitial space. We see this in both endurance and resistance exercise. We might have additional fluid loss as well. This can vary depending on two scenarios. Number one, the duration of the exercise. So again, if I am exercising for a prolonged amount of time, 60, 70 minutes of aerobic exercise, for example, I'm going to lose a significant amount of fluid through sweat. I could lose several pounds of sweat during one given workout. Okay. The other factor that's important for us to consider when we think about fluid loss is environmental conditions. So again, a hot and humid environment would cause us to lose a substantial amount of fluid. Again, when we think about the loss of sweat, that's basically what we're talking about when we think about fluid loss. And it's important for us to appreciate that the fluid within the body can shift through these different compartments pretty easily. So the fluid in the blood can be compromised if we need to dissipate heat because of this thermoregulatory mechanism. Okay. How does hemoconcentration change during exercise? So when we think about hemoconcentration, what we're talking about is the concentration of red blood cells in comparison to fluid, okay? So we see an increase in hemoconcentration 20 to 25% during exercise. And this is a relative change. So we don't have more red blood cells, we simply have less fluid as kind of that background noise within the blood itself. Okay, so hemoconcentration increases, so we have more red blood cells, but it's not because we produced more red blood cells, it's just because we've decreased the other stuff in the blood. Okay. Okay. AVO2 difference is a factor that we already kind of mentioned in a previous slide when we talked about the Fick method for cardiac output. AVO2 difference, again, is the difference in oxygen concentration in the veins versus in the arteries. Okay, so A, arterial, V, venous, O2 difference. Okay, so basically we're looking at the difference in oxygen concentration in the arteries versus in the veins, and that gives us information about how much oxygen is extracted at the tissue level. Okay, so at rest we're using about 5 out of 20 mils. Okay, so again, if I started with 20 units of oxygen in the arteries, I'm leaving with about 15. So I'm dropping off about 5 mils of oxygen at the tissues when we're at rest. Okay, so 75% of the oxygen that we deliver is returned through the veins. So when we say deoxygenated blood, it's really not deoxygenated. We still have 75% of that oxygen in the blood that's leaving the tissues. Okay. During exercise, we're going to increase this to about 12 out of 20 mils. So again, if I had 20 mils to start with, 12 of them are going to be excreted. So again, we're still at like less than 50% of the oxygen that we have in the blood being dropped off at that tissue level. Okay. So factors affecting exercise AVO2 difference. This is a major factor that we'd like to improve on with chronic training. So we become a little bit better at dropping off this oxygen. So instead of like 40%, maybe we can get up to 60% extraction. And again, that's really not a lot, right? So again, this is one area where we're not super efficient at being able to drop off oxygen and extract it at that tissue level. So some factors that are going to affect our exercise AVO2 difference. So number one, increase oxygen utilization within the muscles. So as I start to use more oxygen, it increases the pressure difference. So I'm able to then deliver more oxygen to that tissue. Also, if we can increase our capillary to fiber ratio, so if we increase the capillary density going to the muscles that we use, that allows us to drop off more oxygen as well. So we'll see that with endurance training, we're able to increase the capillary density at the muscle tissue that we actually utilize frequently. We can also increase the number and size of the mitochondria within the muscle tissue that you're using. So again, if I'm a cyclist, I might see an increase in capillaries leading to my leg muscles. I might also see an increase in the number and size of mitochondria within the cells in my leg muscles. And again, that would enhance my ability to drop off more oxygen because I'd be able to use more oxygen as well. So again, blood flows to specific tissues in proportion to their metabolic activity. So again, the harder I'm working, for example, with my leg muscles, the more blood I will send to that particular area. Maximal cardiac output and AVO2 difference determine VO2 max, which would clearly differentiate endurance athletes from our non-trained individuals, okay? So not only is it important to understand how much blood I can move, but also how effective I am at being able to get oxygen out of that blood as well. Okay, so that's kind of that covers all of the cardiovascular changes that we see with acute exercise. The next system that we're going to take a look at are the ventilatory system or our pulmonary system. Okay, so when we think about acute pulmonary changes, it's important for us to kind of review some of these terms. So again, we think about tidal volume. Tidal volume is the amount of air that we bring in and out in one particular breath. Breathing frequency is how many breaths we're taking per minute. The bronchial tubes, again, are the tubes that allow us to bring air into the lungs. And then the VQ ratio tells us the ratio of ventilation and perfusion or blood flow. So it looks at our ability to match how much air we're bringing in with how much blood we send to the lung tissues. Okay, so let's take a look at these. Okay. All right, so acute exercise. During acute exercise, we need to increase ventilation, right? So ventilation is equivalent to tidal volume times breathing frequency. So imagine that ventilation is equivalent to like cardiac output for the pulmonary system. Okay, so tidal volume, the amount of air that comes in and out in one breath, and then breathing frequency, how many breaths we take per minute. So ventilation is the amount of air movement per minute. Okay, and we can increase this in two ways. We can increase the number of breaths that we take, and we can increase the depth of each breath, or increase the tidal volume. Okay, so two things: increase breathing rate, increase depth of each breath, or increase tidal volume. Okay? So during moderate exercise, trained athletes tend to increase tidal volume very much, and will increase breathing frequency a little bit. Okay, so during moderate exercise, we're going to breathe deeper or increase tidal volume and only see a very small change in breathing frequency. As exercise intensity continues to increase and we get to high intensity, tidal volume will level off and breathing frequency will increase. Okay, so during moderate exercise, the primary change is an increase in tidal volume. During high intensity exercise, the primary change that we see is an increase in breathing frequency. We can also do this thing called entrainment, and this is our conscious manipulation of breathing during kind of like rhythmic exercise. Okay, so entrainment is rhythmic oscillation of a physiological factors such as breathing. So I want you to think about if you use entrainment at all. Okay, so maybe you do and you don't even know that you're doing it. That's very common. I know I've been using cycling as a common example in this lecture, but one thing that we see when we study elite cyclists is as their legs pedal, their breathing rate actually matches that. So each pedal I push down, if I'm going at a high intensity, I'm gonna breathe out. Okay, we would see the same thing if we looked at sprinters in like track and field, for example. And again, a lot of them might not even know that they're doing it, but with each stride they're breathing out. Okay, so they're breathing in a rhythmic way that allows them to kind of stay in unison with the body. Okay, conscious manipulation of our breathing can disturb the regulated physiological adaptation or adjustment. However, we can use entrainment as a way to keep ourselves calm and to keep ourselves relaxed. And so we do see athletes using that in a variety of settings related to exercise. This is just a nice kind of review slide when we think about how we control ventilation during acute exercise. Okay, so let's take a look at each of these factors. So we have an inspiratory center and an expiratory center. Our respiratory center, or a regulation of respiration, is found in the medulla oblongata. So several different types of receptors are going to give us information about inspiration. Okay? Baroreceptors are going to allow us to detect changes in blood pressure. We know that the relationship between the cardiovascular system and the pulmonary system, they're very highly interrelated, so it wouldn't do us a whole lot of good to increase blood flow if we didn't also increase oxygen intake. Okay, so baroreceptors are going to allow us to detect changes in blood pressure. If I increase blood pressure, I should probably also increase my breathing. Okay, so baroreceptors will give us information about what's going on with blood pressure. We have chemoreceptors, which are also going to give us information about blood acidity. So if I increase waste products, so let's say I increase my metabolism and I got a bunch of CO2 or whatever floating around in my blood, these chemoreceptors are going to say, hey, we should probably start breathing more so that we can get rid of some of the CO2. Okay. We also have proprioceptors, and proprioceptors are specialized mechanoreceptors that are located like in muscles and joints, and this will give us information about movement. So again, as I start to jog or something along those lines, start to warm up, my body will detect that I'm moving more than what I am right now as I'm just sitting on the couch. And so therefore, they're going to send a signal to this inspiratory center that says like, hey, we should probably start breathing more. Our person is starting to do more movement. Okay. So those three receptors will send information to the medulla oblongata, and that'll cause us to increase inspiration through the activation of the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve will stimulate the diaphragm, which pushes down, the external intercostals, which are going to pull the ribs anterior and superior in nature, allowing us to bring air in. We also have stretch receptors that will be activated when we breathe in, and those stretch receptors will then cause a stimulation of the expiratory signal, and that expiratory signal could potentially then send a signal to the intercostal nerve, which will stimulate the abdominals and internal intercostals, which are going to allow us to forcefully expire. Okay, so again, the abdominals are going to pull your like insides in, think of it that way, increasing the pressure in your abdominal cavity, which causes us to increase pressure in the thoracic cavity, and that's going to allow us to push the air out more forcefully. The internal intercostals are going to pull the ribs in and down, and again, that's going to decrease the volume in the lungs, which will allow us to force that air out. Okay. So again, we've got this oscillating relationship between the inspiratory center and the expiratory center, which will allow us to increase the rate and depth of the rhythmic breathing. Again, remember that the medulla oblongata is one of the lower centers of the brain. So this isn't something that we're generally consciously thinking about. This just happens when we do exercise, and thankfully we don't really have to think about it. However, there are times where we would want to consciously manipulate breathing, such as like, when you're lifting weights or if you're swimming or something along those lines. We can't just breathe whenever we want. We want to do so in a more controlled manner. So that's going to require us to get some higher order thinking going on with that. So when we think about some of the variations in our normal breathing patterns, during exercise, this can progress to an effective and highly economical manner, but sometimes can adversely affect our exercise performance. So a couple things related to these variations in breathing patterns. We can experience hyperventilation. Again, that's not something that we desire, but basically if we are breathing too much, hyper means above, so hyperventilation means high breathing, think of it that way. This will cause decreases in CO2 levels, which can cause us to feel lightheaded because it's going to have a negative impact on our pH levels, okay, or the level of acidity that we want to maintain within the blood. Dyspnea is shortness of breath or distress during breathing. Again, we can see this in novice exercisers when they have an increase in CO2 levels. We could also see it in somebody who's asthmatic, but usually it's related to low aerobic fitness levels. So again, somebody that doesn't have a great amount of fitness, or their body isn't super comfortable doing aerobic exercise yet, they might experience this shortness of breath during, moderate, low, high intensity exercise. The Valsalva maneuver is something that we utilize in strength training, and again, we'll talk in more detail about that when we get to our resistance training or anaerobic section. But basically, this is used to increase intrathoracic pressure more than 150 millimeters of mercury above our resting levels. Okay, so again, when we use the Valsalva maneuver, it increases the pressure that we have within the thoracic cavity or abdominal and thoracic cavity. And we use that to kind of stabilize our core during some lifting. So for example, if I'm doing a squat and I'm an advanced lifter, I'm going to use the Valsalva maneuver in order to keep my spine aligned and stable while I'm in the lift phase. Okay, so the Valsalva maneuver is basically like what you do when you like try to poop. It's that like that kind of feeling. So again, you're kind of holding everything in and kind of tightening things up. And that's what we do. Again, we can use that when we lift as well. It's the same mechanism that we use like in childbirth to help push baby out. So again, like childbirth, pooping, and some scenarios for lifting are some examples of when we use that Valsalva maneuver. VQ ratio. So again, we think about the defining this. V is ventilation. Q is perfusion. So again, we're looking at the relationship between bringing air in and blood flow. Okay, so this gives us information about the efficiency of the cardiovascular and pulmonary systems kind of working together. Okay, let's see if I can draw something. I apologize that I don't have a touch screen, so I'm going to just do my best here to kind of demonstrate what's happening at rest, during moderate, and during high intensity exercise with these two factors. Okay. I'm going to get fancy here. See if I can change my... Okay. So down here at the bottom, this is rest, this is moderate intensity, and this is high intensity. Okay. So VQ, okay, at rest, so let me label these as well. We'll put them up here. Okay, hopefully that's somewhat legible for you. Okay, so here you can see at rest, our ratio is 0.8. So imagine that you have like, again, these are arbitrary numbers. Okay, so at rest, I'm bringing in like 8 ventilation, 8 molecules, and 10 is my unit for blood flow. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is blood flow is greater than ventilation when we're at rest. Okay, so there's this mismatch, right? I have more blood flow going to the lungs than air coming in to match it. And that's okay because at rest, we're not really stressing the system. So it's okay that we have this mismatch going on. Okay. As I increase exercise intensity to a moderate level, so that's kind of this middle notch. Again, these are arbitrary numbers. Know that both ventilation and blood flow are increasing. Now we're pretty darn efficient. Okay, so 15 and 15. So we're able to match these things. Both values have increased, and now we have an equivalent amount of air coming in and blood to meet it. So everything is perfect in the world when we look at exercise at a moderate intensity. Okay. As I increase my exercise intensity to maximal, so that's kind of this third notch over here on the right, notice that ventilation increases to a greater extent than blood flow. Okay, so now let's say, again, I'm just making numbers up. Say that's 30, and we'll say that's 20. Don't memorize these numbers. I'm just trying to show you an example. You don't have to worry about these numbers. I would know the 0.8 and the 5.0 though. Okay. So again, when we get to maximal exercise, we have increased both ventilation and we've increased blood flow. Okay. But notice that ventilation has increased substantially more than blood flow. And the reason for that is lungs, their only job is to get oxygen in and get CO2 out. That's all they have to do, right? So it's easy for them to be able to increase substantially. The cardiovascular system has to do a lot of other things, right? Imagine that I'm exercising in a hot environment, right? So blood has to be carried to the skin so I can dissipate heat. Blood has to go to the heart to supply oxygen to the heart tissue. We're also trying to send blood to all the muscles that we're utilizing. I need to send a little bit to the brain. So the cardiovascular system has a lot of other tasks to do. And so as a result, yes, we're going to increase, but not to the same extent as what we see with ventilation, right? So what that tells us here during maximal exercise is that the cardiovascular system is limiting us. Ventilation is not a limiting factor for us during maximal aerobic exercise. Let me say that again. Ventilation is not a limiting factor for us during maximal aerobic exercise, okay? The cardiovascular system is limiting us. Okay? So what that tells us from a training perspective is that we don't really see a whole lot of change within the ventilatory pathways with chronic training. However, we see substantial changes in the cardiovascular system because this system is what's limiting us during maximal exercise, right? Another factor to keep in mind when we think about what's going on from a ventilatory standpoint is this ventilatory threshold or anaerobic threshold. Again, those terms are sometimes used interchangeably, which is fine. I mean, they occur at basically the same time. From a conceptual standpoint, they represent two different things. So let's take a look at kind of the difference between these two things. So our ventilatory threshold represents the point at which ventilation increases substantially in regards to or in relationship to oxygen consumption, okay? So oxygen consumption is increasing in a linear way, but then we get to this ventilatory threshold and we're breathing substantially more than what we need to based on the oxygen intake. And the reason for that is not that we're trying to get more oxygen in, we're trying to get more waste products out. Okay, so that's what the ventilatory threshold is. The way in which we measure this is measure changes in ventilation, right? So we're able to look at how much oxygen or how much air I'm bringing in and blowing out, and that will give me information or tell me what that ventilatory threshold is, okay? Anaerobic threshold, again, occurs at the same time point and actually stimulates this change in ventilatory threshold. Okay, so again, oxygen consumption is increasing in this nice stepwise manner. However, we are increasing the amount of waste products that we have because from a metabolic standpoint, I am producing more waste products, okay? So above my anaerobic threshold, I am relying on anaerobic fuel. So below, over here, we're using the oxidative pathways. Once I hit the anaerobic threshold, now I'm relying on the anaerobic glycolytic pathways and the ATP phosphocreatine pathways. Those pathways don't require me to get more oxygen in, but they are going to produce more waste product. And again, that waste product production is what's going to stimulate more ventilation so that we can blow out or get rid of those waste products. Okay, when we think about metabolic changes during acute aerobic exercise, again, this should be a review because we just covered metabolism in lecture 2, as our intensity increases, our metabolic rate also increases linearly, right? So what I'm trying to say is maybe at rest, we burn 100 calories per hour. During a low intensity exercise, maybe we burn 200 to 300 calories per hour. During moderate intensity exercise, maybe we burn 500 calories per hour. During high intensity exercise, maybe we burn 1,000 calories per hour, okay? So metabolic rate or calorie expenditure will increase linearly as it is related to the intensity of the exercise. When we think about fuel choice, as we increase exercise intensity, we will increase our reliance on carbohydrates as a fuel. At low intensities, we're going to rely more on fats. At high intensities, we will rely more on carbs. As we increase exercise duration above 30 to 60 minutes, we're going to increase our reliance on fats as a fuel source. Okay, so low intensity exercise, we use fats. Prolonged exercise above 60 minutes, we're going to rely on fats as well. High intensity exercise, we will use carbs. Okay. How does RER change during acute exercise? Again, it's going to increase linearly because this tells us information about carb utilization, okay? So again, as I increase in exercise intensity, I increase my RER, which tells us that we're using carbohydrates as a fuel, okay? This just shows us the relationship between time and energy pathways, okay? So in the first 2 seconds of exercise, we're gonna use ATP storage. So again, whatever ATP we have stored in the muscle. As I increase to like 10 seconds, notice that I've kicked in that phosphocreatine portion of that energy system. So I'm utilizing that phosphocreatine in order to regenerate ATP for those 10 seconds or so. And then notice I'm going to kick over to that lactic acid or that anaerobic glycolytic pathway up to 2 minutes. And then above and beyond 2 minutes, we're going to utilize those aerobic pathways. So again, this chart shows us the relationship between duration of exercise and which energy pathways we would prefer to use. And this shows us energy utilization when we look specifically at aerobic exercise. So again, ATP will last us, 2 to 4 seconds. The phosphocreatine pathways, this says 8 seconds. I think it's probably more like 10 to 12 potentially. Glycogen, so this is our sugar storage, can last us 60 to 90 minutes. And then fats will be utilized as our primary fuel source up to 120 hours. So we have enough fat stored that we can check out the calorie content. 70,000 calories of fat stored. So we can do a lot of aerobic work just with fat that we have stored, okay? Here you can see the relationship between calories burnt and exercise intensity. So total calories burned per minute and exercise intensity, okay? So again, you can see this kind of linear relationship or pretty linear relationship between calorie expenditure and exercise intensity. Again, we can measure that with heart rate. So again, as heart rate increases, calorie expenditure also increases. And those are both factors that are linearly changing with intensity. So as intensity increase, heart rate increases. As intensity increases, calories burned will also increase. Okay. So again, just a nice little review for you as it relates to some of those neural factors. So now we're going to, I'm sorry, as it relates to the metabolic factors associated with acute aerobic exercise. So now we're going to take a look at what goes on from a neural standpoint. And some of these neural changes we'll see will also occur when we do anaerobic exercise as well. But we know that first and foremost, we must activate the SNS or the sympathetic nervous system. Okay? Know that the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight system. So we're going to activate this in any time of stress, whether that's physical or mental in nature, anytime we perceive something as a stressor. Okay? We're also going to recruit appropriate motor units and we are going to recruit type 1 motor units, those aerobic or slow twitch fibers, during aerobic exercise. We're also going to have them stimulated in a synchronized way, right? So again, the more experienced I become with a particular activity, again, let's use swimming as an example, the better I am at synchronizing the activation of those motor units that will allow me to complete this coordinated activity with efficiency. Okay. Speaking of swimming, we're going to go to the cerebellum. Our cerebellum has, imagine your cerebellum has like all these files, okay? And so inside the cerebellum, you've got these file cabinets, and inside the file cabinets, you have a file for each different type of activity that you want to do, okay? So for example, I might go to my file cabinet and reach in and get my file for swimming freestyle. Okay, so I have a stored motor plan that tells me how to complete that activity. It's a fairly complicated activity that requires some coordination and things like that. And I've created that motor plan over time as I have completed this activity many, many times. Okay, so many repetitions allows us to create a motor plan for various coordinated activities. Okay, and then you can reach into the file cabinet and grab these folders, which tells your body how to complete this activity without you really thinking about it. Okay. The cerebral cortex affects our psychological state during the exercise bout. This will allow us to fine tune and modify motor plans when needed. Okay, so for example, let's say I am a tennis player and I reach into my cerebellum. It's my turn to serve the ball, and I reach in and get my motor plan that I need to complete my serve. Okay, and so I complete my serve for my first attempt, and I don't get the serve in. And the reason I don't get the serve in, I know from higher order thinking, is it's pretty windy out. Okay, so my cerebral cortex is going to allow me to fine tune that motor plan that I've used thousands and thousands of times in order to account for the fact that it's windy. So maybe it's I need to hit the ball a little less hard in order to get it in, right? Or maybe I need to hit it harder depending on which direction the wind is coming from. My cerebral cortex will give me the information and communicate that with that stored motor plan that I have, so that I can fine tune my serve in order to get the serve in on my second attempt. Okay. Okay. So again, that gives us just kind of some basic information about what's going on from a neural perspective. Next thing we want to look at is what's going on at the muscular level. Okay. Again, keep in mind that these are highly related. Our changes in the muscles are going to be related to what's going on in the nervous system. Okay, so we're going to have selective activation or recruitment of the appropriate motor units. Again, we said we would like to recruit our type 1 muscle fibers. We're going to enhance metabolism within those appropriate muscle fibers. So again, I'm going to have more activation of the oxidative pathways within the muscle fibers that I'm actually utilizing, so those type 1 fibers. I'm also going to see an increase in temperature at the level of the muscles, and this will enhance our contractile force, so it allows us to produce more force within that particular muscle. It can also allow us to increase the speed of muscle contraction and help us to clear out the waste products produced from that increased metabolic functioning within those particular cells as well. Again, which type of muscle fibers would I prefer to activate? I want to activate my type 1 or those slow twitch fibers during this acute aerobic exercise bout. What's happening from a hormonal standpoint? So I'm going to see changes in many of our hormones. Again, keep in mind that the release of hormones is going to cause kind of this all-encompassing effect on the body. So these hormones are going to travel in the blood and affect many various organs and various tissues within the body. Okay, so I'm going to see changes in epinephrine, norepinephrine, ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, cortisol, which is a stress hormone, growth hormone, and insulin. Okay, so let's take a look at what's happening with each of these. Okay. We will see an increase in all hormones with the exception of insulin. Insulin is going to decrease during acute aerobic exercise. Okay. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are your catecholamines, or your like adrenaline, think of them that way. They're going to have like a shit ton of different responses within the body, right? So they're going to do a lot of different things within the body to enhance our ability to exercise. ADH is antidiuretic hormone, and this is going to increase so that we are not losing fluids. So ADH is going to help us retain fluids, which is going to be important because I'm going to be sweating out some fluids. So ADH is going to help us retain fluids in the blood so that I'm not having to pee them out. So that's kind of what how we shift fluids during that acute exercise bout, so we don't get dehydrated. Cortisol, again, is a stress hormone. So again, I'm going to increase cortisol so that I am able to enhance recovery in the muscles immediately post-exercise. So that's good news. Again, same deal with growth hormone. Again, we don't often think about like recovery as much when we think about aerobic exercise, but it is important, particularly if we're doing, a long exercise bout or something that's higher intensity aerobic exercise. Cortisol and growth hormone are going to help us recover those type 1 muscle fibers immediately post-exercise. Okay. Insulin's job is to help us store sugars. The reason that we're going to decrease insulin during acute exercise is we don't want to store sugars. We want to have sugars ready so that we can use them. So it wouldn't make sense for us to be trying to store them when we are also going to be needing sugars in order to complete the exercise bout. So as a result, we'll see a decrease in insulin levels because we don't want to store things. Okay. So again, that gives us a nice a nice overview of what's going on during aerobic acute exercise, really hitting all the major systems of the body. So the next thing we want to look at is a factor known as VO2 max. And VO2 max represents the amount of oxygen that we can consume during maximal exercise. Okay, so in our metabolism lab, which a lot of you are finishing up now, we've measured VO2 while we're at rest. And VO2 represents the amount of oxygen that we're utilizing at a given time per minute. Okay, VO2 max represents the maximum amount of oxygen that I could potentially use in 1 minute. And so essentially when we think about VO2 max, it's really pretty complicated. Okay, so it involves several different processes. Number one, we have to bring air into the lungs and into the alveoli, which is the terminal unit of the lungs. Then from the alveoli, we're going to move that oxygen into the blood, and that's known as external respiration. Once we get that oxygen into the blood, we're going to carry it to the muscles. Okay. Once that oxygen reaches the muscles, we're going to move the oxygen from in the blood to into the skeletal muscle cell, and that's known as internal respiration. Then once it's inside the cell, we're going to carry it from like the edge of the cell into the mitochondria so that we can use it. And then lastly, we're going to utilize that oxygen through the electron transport chain in order to produce ATP through aerobic metabolism. And we know that the electron transport chain is responsible for about 90% of our energy production. Okay, so again, keep in mind that there's a lot of shit going on in order for us to deliver and utilize oxygen. So also note that, there are many different factors that we need to consider if we would want to improve our VO2 max. Okay. So how could I test this? How can I estimate or test my VO2 max, and why would I care about this, right? So VO2 max is commonly tested through a test known as indirect calorimetry through the use of our metabolic cart. And again, we'll have the opportunity in this class to either test your VO2 max or observe someone else being tested through the use of the metabolic cart. Again, when we use the metabolic cart to do a VO2 max test, we want to do graded and incremental exercise. Okay, so we'll do a treadmill test that will involve graded. So again, graded and incremental. So every 3 minutes, the exercise test gets harder. Okay, so you're going to start at a walk, and then it's a brisk walk, and then it's a jog, and then it's more of a run, and then it's a fast run, right? So again, every 3 minutes, the exercise bout gets harder. Okay, so that's how we do a VO2 max test. However, there are many submaximal tests that we can use to estimate VO2 max. We also have some maximal aerobic fitness tests that can estimate our VO2 max tests. So when we think about the accuracy of these VO2 max tests, the most accurate way to do it is this VO2 max test through the use of the metabolic cart, because it actually measures the oxygen consumption. A second would be the maximal aerobic fitness test. And third, in terms of accuracy, would be those submaximal exercise tests. Okay, you'll be writing about these in your first lab report on aerobic fitness. So you'll get to do some research into how accurate each of these actually are. Okay. VO2 max tests, as we said, are usually graded and incremental, starts easy and gets harder. Our increments are usually 3 to 4 minutes in duration. The reason they're 3 to 4 minutes in duration is 3 minutes seems to be like long enough so that we can reach a steady state before we go up a level, okay? We can also do a stress test. So again, we would do this, you know, so there's like 2 different professions you can have as an exercise physiologist. So again, that's what my background is. That's what my specialty is. So number 1, you can teach and research, which is what I do. Number 2, you can work in a hospital and do stress testing. Okay, so the stress testing allows us to be diagnostic in nature. So it allows us to determine if somebody has a cardiovascular problem. And again, we'll do a unit and talk about what stress testing looks like and things like that. But when we do a stress test, the increments for that are 1 minute in duration. And again, the reason for that is we're less concerned with figuring out what their VO2 max is, and we're more concerned with diagnosing cardiac issues. So again, we'll talk about those differences later, but know that stress testing is graded and incremental as well. The increments are only 1 minute with that. With our VO2 max testing, we'll have our increments be 3, sometimes 4 minutes, but again, usually 3 minutes, and we'll use 3 minutes in this class. Okay, so when we think about these VO2 max testing protocols, really 3 different options to think about. So we can do the Bruce treadmill protocol, McConnell treadmill protocol, and a cycle ergometer protocol. The McConnell protocol is what we will use in this class. When we do testing on general population, we usually use the Bruce treadmill protocol. I prefer to use McConnell because it's more accurate for athletes. And so as college students in the kinesiology program, it seems more appropriate to use the McConnell protocol, but I am going to explain to you the differences between Bruce and McConnell. Cycle ergometer protocol can be used, basically it's an incremental test on a bike. So again, I'll start at a low intensity and increase the intensity every 3 minutes. We don't have a cycle ergometer, so I don't have that to kind of compare and contrast for you in our lab here. However, the treadmill protocol will give you a higher reading because you're able to activate more muscle mass. If you were a trained cyclist, you'd be able to get your cycle VO2 max to be pretty similar to what your treadmill VO2 max is. I've done both tests many, many times in various scenarios, and as a triathlete, I'm able to get my cycle VO2 maxes pretty darn close to my treadmill VO2 max. So again, but for the average person, if you're not, cycling regularly, it's usually about 10% less with the cycle. Okay. Again, we usually see the highest readings with the McConnell protocol, particularly for athletic population. The Bruce protocol is slightly less strenuous because the incline changes are significantly greater, but we do less running in that. So let me show you what the protocols look like so we can kind of compare these. So here you can see the difference between the Bruce and McConnell. So notice that with the McConnell, you do get a 1 minute warm up. You're going 4 miles per hour, which is like a brisk walk. And then the next stage, you're at 5 miles per hour. So you're basically running from stage 2 on. The reason this protocol is not great for non-athletes is like for a lot of people, they can't run, right? So like if I had my mom do this, she might make it 4 minutes. I don't know if she could run on a treadmill at this pace for 3 minutes. I don't know for sure. And again, she's just your average like 60-year-old lady. So again, this wouldn't give her a very accurate reading because she wouldn't be able to run, although her fitness is probably decent. So again, people aren't able to get far enough in this protocol. So this is more strenuous. So not great for your average population, but is good for the fit people. And for Bruce over here, notice that the miles per hour is significantly lower. So I can walk probably up till the 3rd stage. So I can get 9 minutes of walking in. Notice that the grade is substantial. So I have to, walk up a pretty steep hill. However, I can walk for up to 9 minutes in this stage. This stage is like pretty awkward, like you're on a significant incline, but it's a pretty fast pace. So it's like this awkward, like, do I run? Do I like walk super fast? So it's kind of like this awkward pace here. But again, I can make it at least 9 minutes in the Bruce before I need to start running. With this protocol, I have to run pretty much right away. So that makes it challenging. So again, you'll get to see all of this when we do this in lab, but here are some factors that I'm looking for when determining whether or not someone has reached their VO2 max. Number one, I want to see a plateau in VO2 despite an increase in workload. So let me show you let me see if I can draw for you again, my excellent artistic ability. So again, not a straight line, but when I start out with my exercise bout, you'll notice that intensity and VO2 are increasing linearly. Okay, then there's going to become a point where the intensity continues to increase, but my VO2 flattens out. Okay, and the reason for that is I've reached my max, and now I'm relying exclusively on anaerobic fuel in order to continue to run, right? So that's what we're looking for here. That's the true way that we know you've reached your VO2 max. Heart rate greater than 95% of age predicted max. That's actually pretty easy to get to for the average person, in my opinion. This is harder to get to. This plateau in VO2 is really, really hard. And my advisor always, my graduate advisor would always say, okay, you have to get a person to where they think they're at their max and then make them keep going, right? So again, I always remembered that the very first VO2 max test I did, I got done, I looked at the data and things like that, and yes, I was at 95% of my heart rate, and yes, I thought I felt like I was at a 10. Then when you look at these numbers like VO2 and the RER, there was more to give there. So that was something that I always keep in mind, like we can push our athletes further than they think they can go. So it was really cool for me to kind of start to understand this relationship between the psychological factors and what you think you can do and what you actually can do from a physiological standpoint. So I think that's really cool. So again, RER of greater than 1.1. So that tells us that we're relying exclusively on carbs, and above 1 tells us that we've got that anaerobic contribution. And then RPE, or our rate of perceived exertion is 10. So we feel like we're working as hard as we possibly can in order to do so. Ideally, we want to have at least 2 of these 4 criteria met in order for us to really say that it's a true VO2 max. In reality, we've got to stop when the subject wants to stop. So in reality, we're going to continue to have them exercise until they reach volitional fatigue or they feel like they can't go any further. And then we'll consider that their VO2 max. Okay. So again, sometimes the physiological numbers, I should say, usually we stop before we physiologically are tapped out. Okay, so mentally we stop before we reach our physical max. And that's really cool to see. So I'm excited for you guys to really see that when we do these tests in our lab, right? I think I'll stop here for today. Again, we'll finish up this unit on Monday via Zoom. I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you soon.